Hello, I'm Patty Simpson with Simpson Math. In this video, we're going to do another example of a classical or theoretical probability problem. So here, three people each roll a six-sided die. So person one rolls a die, person two rolls a die, and person three rolls a die. Then all three dice are added. So maybe that one rolled a 1, and this one rolled a 2, and that one rolled a 3. You just add them together. 1 plus 2 is 3, plus 3 makes 6. I want to know, what is the probability the dice sum to 3? So when we add all three of the dice together, what's the probability that we get a sum of 3? So when we work these classical or theoretical probability problems, the first thing we want to do is write down in words how we would go about getting whatever it is that we're looking for. So in this case, our event is that they sum to 3. So we have to think about, what would they roll so that when they all sum together, they add up to be 3? Well, in order for that to happen, each person would have to roll a 1. So in words, I'm going to write and just write how they would go about getting that 3. So they would have to roll, the first person would have to roll a 1, and the second person would have to roll a 1, and the third person would have to roll a 1. So we would have to roll a 1 and a 1 and a 1. Once you have the how to do it in words, then it makes finding the probability of each thing a little bit easier. So now I can find the probability that each person rolls a 1. So the probability that this person rolls a 1 is 1 out of 6, because there's 6 sides on a die, and there's 1 on that 6-sided die. This and because they're independent, we're going to multiply these together. So that and reminds me I'm multiplying. The probability the second person rolls a 1 is also 1 out of 6. And then the probability the third person rolls a 1 is also 1 out of 6. So the probability that they roll a 1 and a 1 and a 1 is 1 out of 216. Let's take that same idea, and now let's just change our sum to be 18. Now again, what we have to do first is figure out how they could go about rolling a sum of 18. What would each person have to roll in order for, when they add them together, the sum to add up to be 18? Well, if the first one rolls a 1, that would mean the other two would have to roll 17 between them. But 6 plus 6 just makes 12. So they can't roll 17 between them. In fact, if you look at that 18 and you divide it amongst all three of them, they could all each roll 6 in order to get to 18. So let's just start there. So a 6 and a 6 and a 6. And that's, anybody rolls anything lower than a 6, then the other two won't have enough to get to 18. So this is the only way we can get to 18, is to roll a 6 and a 6 and a 6. And again, we want to put this in words first to help us with the probability. So then once we have it in words, then we can go back and put the probabilities with it. What's the probability the first one rolls a 6? It's 1 out of 6. And tells me to multiply. What's the probability the second one rolls a 6? It's 1 out of 6. And the third one. And so the probability that they roll an 18 is the same as the probability of them rolling a 3. It's 1 out of 216. Let's make it a little bit trickier. What about if we wanted a sum of 4? Let's look and see, how could we get a sum of 4? So in this case, if they're going to sum to 4, and the first person, dividing that by 3, well, we've got 1 and then a little bit. So we're going to have a little bit left over. So dividing that up, we're going to have somebody roll something different. So if the first person rolls a 1, and the second person rolls a 1, then the third person, in order to get up to 4, would have to roll a 2. So that's one way they could get a sum of 4. But they could do it another way. Because in this case, the last person rolled a 2. But maybe, instead of the last person rolling a 2, maybe the first person rolls a 2. So maybe they do a 2, and then if that one rolls a 2, there's only 2 left. So that means each one of them has to roll 1. Or maybe this middle guy rolls a 2. So there's a third way. The first one could roll a 1, and the second one could roll a 2, and the third one could roll a 1. Now, everybody had a chance to roll that 2, while the other 2 rolled 1s. And 2 plus 1 plus 1 is the only way we can get to 4. Now that we have written down all the different ways that we can get to 4, now we can go back and put in the probabilities. So the probability you roll any one particular number on a die is 1 out of 6. Then the ands, I'm going to multiply. The ors tell me to add. So I'm just putting 1/6 for each of those probabilities. The probability this guy rolls a 2, the probability this guy rolls a 1, and the ands tell me to multiply, and the ors tell me to add. Then 1/6 times 1/6 times 1/6. Now we've already seen that 1/6 times 1/6 times 1/6 is 1 out of 216. So notice that all 3 of these are the same. So we could take and say, well, this one's 1 out of 216, plus this one's 1 out of 216, plus this one's 1 out of 216, and then add them together to get 3 out of 216. Or we could simply say, let's just multiply it. There are 3 different ways to come about this problem. And we know the probability for each one of them is 1 out of 216. So we could just multiply 3 times 216. Now remember, we just multiply straight across, so you get 3 out of 216. But I like to simplify before I multiply, instead of simplifying afterwards. So I'm going to divide the top and bottom by 3, or this 3 goes into that 216. Well, 3 goes into 21 7 times, and 3 goes into 6 2 times. And I still have that 1 left over. So 1 out of every 72 times the 3 people roll it, I would expect them to get a sum of 4. Let's do a really tricky one. Let's sum it to 6. So again, we're going to find all the different ways that we can sum to 6. And the first thing we want to do is put it into words. That's the first thing we want to do. So we've got to come up with all those different possibilities, all the different ways that we can sum to 6. I'm going to use my first trick and just take it and divide it by 3 people, so that if they got an even amount, how much would they each have to roll? So one could roll a 2 and a 2 and a 2. And that would add up to 6, because 2 plus 2 plus 2 adds up to 6. That's one way they could get a sum of 6. But just like before, we could do it in some other ways. Maybe one of them rolls a 1. So let's see what happens if one of them rolls a 1. So if one of them rolls a 1, and the second one also rolls a 1, then that third one would need to roll a 4 so that they summed to 6. Now, it could be the third person that rolled the 4, but it could also be the second person, or it could be the first person. So there are actually 3 different possible ways for us to get this 1 and 1 and 4, to get 2 1s and a 4. So that's one. but then the first person could, or the second person could. So far we have 1, 2, 3, 4 different ways for us to get a sum of 6. Then what about here, we said the first one rolled a 1, but what if the second one, instead of rolling a 1, rolled a 2? Then that would mean the third one would need to roll a 3. So we have a 1 and a 2 and a 3. But maybe they do it in the opposite order. Maybe he still rolls a 1, but the second one rolls a 3, and the third one rolls a 2. So that's another way that they could get a sum of 6. Or maybe it's not the first one that rolls the 1. Maybe the second one rolls the 1. Well, if the second guy rolls a 1, then the first guy could roll the 2, and the last guy could roll the 3. Or, if the second one rolls the 1, the first one could roll the 3, and the last guy could roll the 2. Or, so far the first one's rolled the 1, the second one rolls the 1. Let's see if the third one rolled the 1. Then the first one could roll the 2, and the second one could roll the 3. Or, the last one still rolling that 1, the first one could roll a 3, and the second one roll a 2. So now, let's think about if there's any other way. Let's think about if the first one rolls a 1, and the second one rolls a 3, well, 1 plus 3 makes 4, then the last one would have to roll a 2. Oh, we already have that scenario there. So it turns out that we can't roll any other combination of 6. These are all the different ways that they could sum to be 6. Let's look and see how many different ways there were. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 total different ways for us to get a sum of 6. So now what we're going to do is find the probability of each of those. Well, we know to find the probability of one number in a particular die is just 1 out of 6. And that's going to be true for each one of these, that it's going to be 1/6, 1/6, 1/6 for all 10 of those. And the ands tell us to multiply. So we're just going to be multiplying on all 10 of these, 1/6 times 1/6 times 1/6. So each individual possibility here, the probability is 1 out of 216. But then the ors tell us that we're going to add them all together. So we're going to add together all 10 of those 216s. Instead of adding 1 over 216 over and over again, we can just multiply 10 times that 1 over 216. You can just multiply straight across so you get 10 over 216. I could do it that way this time. Normally I like to simplify before I multiply, but remember with fractions we're just multiplying straight across. And then we'll need to reduce. So 2 goes into the top and into the bottom. So the probability that we get a sum of 6 is 5 over 108. So out of every 108 times that our 3 people roll their dice, we would expect 5 of those to be a sum of 6. So first, think about all the different ways that you can come up with your outcome, and then put it into words using those words and or to help out before you finally put in the probability. Thanks for watching.